Hello, welcome to the IC Topic Chats for today. It's January 22nd. We're a couple weeks into the year where everybody's kind of getting momentum for the year. We're excited to have Melissa with us today to talk about independent consulting professionalism, which is IC Topic Chat she's doing today based upon well, I guess as I went back and read them before this, a couple of blog posts that went out through AEA 365. So welcome, Melissa. Feel free to introduce yourself and take over.
Okay,
Thank you.
great. So I kind of merged two different blog posts that came about on professionalism. I'm with the Institute for Biomedical Philosophy. We're a University Support Services Institute, and a lot of the work that I do is around evaluation and partnership development. So I'll just go ahead and get started. Let me see that work. Okay. So, I wanted to explore independent consultant professionalism with this group and thought about, some of the goals that we might have as we're doing this exploration. One is to intentionally frame the evaluation process and the research processes specifically within an ethical framework, so that we can support a thriving community practice, right? So that we can um, work together on that. Um, Another one is as we join together to constructively maintain professional evaluation standards and support one another in a collegial fashion. Um, and then importantly related to that is guarding against undermining one another as we struggle with the various challenges that we all face. So this was this grew out of um some things that were happening that kind of needed to be addressed, and uh was suggested that um we can think about it in this way. So um I don't know why that's in there. All right. So let me get on here. Okay. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that both the research community and the evaluation community um, probably has a number of concerns, emotions, questions um, related to shifts in federal priorities, which we're going to talk about a little bit. The uncertainty that's generated by a number of shifts, and also potential loss of revenue that some folks may have experienced, um, or concerns that they may lose revenue in the future, right? So whether they have or haven't, it's kind of irrelevant. So I just want to put that out there, so I think everyone's sympathetic to these issues, but I just want to say that straight up before we get going. Um, One of the things that I'd like us to think about is the development of an inner evaluator code of conduct. And that's the second blog that I wrote about, and I just wanted to talk about that one first. Um, so I played around with this with a few other people and tried to make sure that it was in alignment with AEA's mission to improve evaluation practices and to promote evaluation as a profession, and also with AEA values, including an understanding of evaluation practices and the continual development of evaluation professionals. Um, I was very surprised when the some issues came up, and I went to go see, well, how do we deal with one another? What do we have rules with how we deal with one another? And I found there is no inter-evaluator code of conduct within our group. So, which I found quite surprising considering we have rules about everything in life nowadays. This is not articulated anywhere that I could find. Um, and so wanted to sort of play around with this idea. Um, and the I feel like there's a real need for this, right? It's not just someone's in the waiting room. It's not just it's not just an intellectual exercise, but I think it's really important that our community have shared and trusted processes and ways that we engage with one another, so that um, we can both thrive and we can address a number of issues that come up. So one of the things is thinking about how we manage information that we encounter about each other's practices. There are a number of ways besides forums like this where people are have chosen to share information with one another, where we encounter each other's practices. Also, thinking about ethical issues related to behaviors that might be perceived as predatory of each other's work, and just professional practices of how we interact as a community, right? Just start to think about these things in terms of our professionalism. Um, so when I looked at what we do have as a community, we have these guiding principles, evaluator guiding principles. Those guiding principles really have to do with how we deal with our stakeholders and or our clients, not with one another. So three of them, integrity, respect for people, and common good, seem like good places to start. And I've changed the wording very slightly to think about how we would work with one another. So integrity is simply that we're going to behave honestly and with transparency as we interact with one another, not just with our clients, not just with our stakeholders, but with one another. Respect for people. Evaluators honor the dignity, well-being, and self-worth of other evaluators and acknowledge the influence of culture within and across groups. Again, we have a statement like that for how we deal with the other people we work with, just not with one another. And then we'll try to work together to contribute to our association, right? That we want the AEA to be as functional and helpful an organization as possible, within the context of ethical standards. So I broke them down into more parts, just like we have in the guiding principles. Okay, so let's think about integrity first. So when we communicate truthfully with one another, sometimes what that communication needs to be that I can't tell you something, right? So there are times when we have confidential information for other folks that we're working with. Um, and so sometimes communicating truthfully is telling someone that you're not allowed to share information, right? Or that you need to first go get permission to share information and think about that before we just send things on to one another. Most people are happy for you to share information. So generally you ask permission, you get permission, and then you do it. But sometimes there's something that comes up that someone doesn't want you to share. Um, Secondly, I alluded to this previously. So many of us are in a position where maybe we're working with a funder, we're a reviewer, we're a contractor, or maybe we have a role within AEA or within our TIGs, where we will receive information about other evaluators and their practices, right? Um, it's important that we both don't share this information. We treat it as confidential and that we don't use it to our advantage, right? So that we don't take information that we receive in one context and use it specifically to our advantage. Um, the next one's very easy. Proper citation, proper credits through whatever means is appropriate when you're using other people's work. Um, and then the last one there is different than anything that's written in the other format with working with our clients. And I think this one is important, and other people may not. That's why I'm hoping we'll discuss these things, is that evaluators will not attempt to disrupt relationships of other evaluators with their clients or collaborators, including attempting to obtain contracts for work either promised or in progress by other evaluators. To me, um, I think that most people would say that's an appropriate ethical approach to working together in this world. Sometimes um, you might be approached by someone who has an evaluator, who, for whatever reason, they're making a change. I think that's different. What we're talking about here is actively trying to disrupt relationships with folks, or going after work you know is already somebody else is already working on it. Um, I think that's the one that probably people might have the most pushback against. Um, Respect for people. Okay, so this term, community generosity, I'd like to introduce to this group. It's a term that I've learned from one of my sociology colleagues, and I think it's a really important concept to encourage community generosity. Some people may use the term of giving grace to other people, but this I think is a little broader than that. Um, so the concept of communicative generosity is that when you're communicating with another person, you try to understand, you try to be aware and understand that language use is different across generations, across regions, and across groups, right? So there may be words that your grandmother learned to use as being the polite words that are no longer the polite words. And when someone uses something that's based on their prior experience in those contexts, it's important to understand that the person's usage of language is shaped from their experience. And by doing that, you can try to focus on their intentions and encourage communication across groups without people being constantly in fear of censor or retaliation. It's really clear to make clear that this is not an avenue to allow or encourage hateful or discriminatory language. It's rather a way to try and understand where people are coming from. I want to give you an example that my colleague that actually um, talked to me about this term gave. So there was a senior faculty member, and a student came up to them for help. They had some questions, and they came up to them for help. And the senior faculty member said, sure, let's hook up after class, and and I can help you. Um, my 60-some-year-old colleague had no concept that the college student vernacular for hookup is something very different than our understanding of the word hookup, which simply means to meet with someone, not to engage in additional unappropriate activities with that said person. The student was scandalized, ran, not walked, to their dean or whoever at their institution and reported this faculty member's inappropriate solicitation, which they had no idea they had even made and certainly had not intended to make. That was kind of humorous, right? Not to the two people engaged in it, but we can see from the outside how that word, as used by one person in one generation, that term means something completely different to another generation. Um, and so when someone speaks to us in a way that we're like startled by, maybe you could stop and say, uh, could you tell me what that means? That means something very specific to me. I want to understand what that means for you. Instead of responding with scandal or anger or something else. So try to understand where when people say something, how that term got into their head, right? For different reasons. Um, Related to that is to encourage intellectual freedom and diversity of thought. So that invariably it doesn't matter what we're talking about, perspectives are going to conflict, right? We're all coming, every person is has their own perspective. And it's really the obligation of all the community members to respectfully listen to other perspectives. Again, none of this is to allow or encourage hateful or discriminatory language, but rather to try to, as much as we can, put our emotions aside and try to understand where something is coming from and what its intentions are, um, so that we can have a shared language and a shared communication. Because, I can guarantee you that professor did not want to hook up with their student in order to provide them with with help. But it was just as important for the student to understand what that word meant for him as it was for him to understand what that meant for the student, right? So this is to allow people to really share the way that they speak, and so that I'm pretty sure he never said that to another student after that, right? So it's a learning experience for everyone involved. Um, and I just love that example because he was very freaked out. Um, and I'm sure the student was equally freaked out. So, um, okay. The common good. Promote transparent and active sharing of instruments and other tools that benefit best practices. Um, so we've worked on this through many of the TIGs over time, not as successfully as we would like. Um, to be able to both come up with some shared instruments and also discourage the use of instruments or tools that negatively impact the integrity of evaluation or contribute to discriminatory practices. So if you know there's an instrument out there that really is not a good one to use for whatever reason, it's important to communicate that as well. So um, really thinking about together intentionally, what are some of the instruments we should be using? How should we ask certain questions? One of the things that comes up a lot is how do we deal with demographic factors? Like, what are the ways should we be asking demographic questions? So recently, in the last administration, I believe, I think it might have been under the Biden administration, they changed how the questions for race and ethnicity, I think they put them back together. They used to be two questions. I think they're back together to one question. So, do you ask that as one question? Do you ask that as two questions? Do you ask some other questions as you get more granular for each demographic question? And as you add the number of demographic questions, you make it impossible for unless you have an N of several thousand people, what happens is your data becomes identifiable. And we don't really talk about that very much in terms of how we define our instruments. And what is the purpose of gathering specific demographic information, right? That's an easy one to think about, I think, together as a community. And whether is it best practices to have that be part of the data set in a case of small studies where you have a few hundred people, or should it be a link from the original set of questions so you can gather, who is represented by that data set, but you don't know that Joe said this or Sally said that, right? So um, that's an easy one, but there's lots of other ways that we probably have some great instruments for measuring certain things, and then we have some instruments that just aren't very good that maybe we continue to use um, that we should think about together. And the other thing, in addition to getting information about each other's practices when we're in certain roles, I know when I was a TIG, I was a chair of the STEM TIG, I would get emails and I would get communication. Oh, we're looking for an evaluator. We're looking for somebody to do this, or we're looking for somebody for that. Matt probably gets similar things in his role. And you try and let other people know, right? So like I would just post them up on the you know the various boards, different ways that we have, or send out an email to a large group of people or things like that. So if we're blessed with getting information because of a position that we have, that's not approaching us directly, but saying, hey, here's an opportunity. We should figure out ways to communicate those opportunities in a timely fashion, right? So, um, all right. So I want to switch gears, and I know that was a lot and to unpack, and I'm sure there's some people that are gonna like parts of it and hate parts of it, and so I'm hoping in our conversations we can talk about some of that. Um, but I want to think a little bit about some possible positive outcomes from these shifts in federal priorities and the silver lining, as it were. One of the things that I'm hoping will come from all of this is, and I think we're already seeing it in the those of you that are involved in rewrites. I think we've probably most of us have been involved in multiple rewrites trying to figure out how we need to address these things. I think that people are developing more clearly articulated research questions, more clearly articulated evaluation questions, and equally important, more clearly articulated recruitment methodologies. So, what is a way? So many of us are working with organizations that are focused on particular subpopulations of society. They have specific questions they want to answer, important questions they want to answer with subpopulations of society. So, the, thinking about that, how do we continue to do that kind of work? And so a way that we found to be very successful um, is refocusing the efforts on differential opportunities. Okay. So when you look at differential opportunities, um, you get more clearly articulated goals and you're able to have your research and evaluation questions be more relevant. And ultimately, this should be both more productive and impactful. And what do I mean by this? I'm going to give a simple example of a shift that you could make. So when you want to say, okay, um, I, we want to do this project for students who have not had certain kinds of opportunities. We can look at something like previously engaged in some kind of targeted STEM or other specific practices, right? Um, so maybe you want to look at the impact of after-school program, as after-school STEM program for students who don't have any opportunities to engage in very effective STEM practices, right? So that's what you're looking at. You want to address high needs students who don't have these opportunities, put it in that context. You want to address all the students who have not previously engaged in these kinds of activities. It may be access to advanced or honors courses is the thing that you want to say, okay, these people have not had these kinds of opportunities. It could be access to any kind of resource. I'm just using the STEM ones because I do a lot of the work we do is STEM education. Um, it could be experiencing poverty, right? Um, if um, you need to think about opportunities rather than protected classes. We all know, discrimination of protected classes is unethical and it's illegal, despite the fact that we have for years used protected classes as a way to look at specific um, groups. Um, it is both illegal and more importantly now, there's been other things that have come out about this concept of proxy discrimination. So it's also not lawful or permissible if you're doing federal work to choose a proxy for a protected class, right? So you can't pick um, something that is um, just another way of naming the class. In terms of maybe it's an organization just for women and you want to study women. You can't say, well, we're going to use this organization that only allows women to go in it. That's just a proxy for women. You also cannot just rename protected classes or obfuscate your targeted groups. Okay. Um, people say, oh, we need to use a new word because people have this search technology. So they're going to search my grant for this word, and then my grant's going to get thrown out. Well, if you come up with a new word, they're just going to search for the new word, right? That's not going to be a productive approach. Um, or it's going to be such a ridiculous way that you've attacked the language that people aren't going to understand what you're doing anyway. So these are not going to be a productive way to respond to federal requests, um, or probably to really answer the questions that you're interested in doing. Um, so we're really encouraging folks to focus on inclusion instead of exclusion. If you focus on inclusion, it works out much better. So make sure that the intents and goals of the project are super clear. What is it that you really want to know? What is it that you're really trying to study? Um, Develop a process to include all the relevant participants and stakeholders in the evaluation, and explicitly end the practice of exclusion based on protected classes. This will simplify people's lives in a number of ways because if you use a protected class for your exclusion criteria, a lot of people go cross classes. So a lot of people are not a singular ethnicity or a singular race, right? So people tend to go across these protected classes. Not to mention that how we define them seems to change pretty regularly. So if you use those as exclusion criteria, you're not gonna capture your full population. Um, so you're going to get a more appropriate sample and richer data. As I mentioned, most projects are focused on a group because that group has not had certain opportunities, right? And so if you use a protected class, and I think we've probably all seen this, where you use a protected class, you say, this class is underrepresented, this class has had these challenges with opportunities, and so you use a protected class, and then what you get for your sample maybe are uh, the uh, children of professors or children of doctors, children of lawyers who have had these other kinds of opportunities already and more. And so, because the way it was defined was by a protected class, they were able to include those students or those participants, and it's not really addressing the population that they want to address, which was the students who did not have that opportunity prior to. Um, so it helps both in the reframing of the questions and particularly in the recruitment activities. So you're less likely to use the recruitment of convenience. A lot of times projects end up being a recruitment of convenience to that meet um, the previously way that some of the inclusion criteria were or exclusion criteria were written, but don't really get to the heart if you read what they said they wanted to accomplish. Um, and as we make the shift on focus to inclusion, we really need to support one another to continue to do good work and ask the questions that need to be asked and continue to figure out what are the best ways to frame these questions. What populations are people really interested in including in their work? Um, and again, there's lots that could be argued on the other side of this. And I've been doing this work for 20 some years now, um, close to 30 years. So, um, I understand the challenges, and we work with a lot of different types of institutions, and we've been working with them over time to make this shift. Um, all right. Um, I have after this slide, I actually had some potential things to potentially discuss, but I know it's a lot. There was a lot packaged in those few slides. Um, So I just wanted to make sure I had enough time for us to chew on some of this.
Well, I think that's great, Melissa. I think that there's a lot to talk about here, and I'm sure you haven't been able to follow the chat, but there's
Oh no,
questions
I
and
haven't opened it
thoughts
up at
now,
the.
and so we'll get into that in just a second. But I think what I'll do
Okay.
now is I'll stop the recording, say goodbye to the people out in YouTube world, and for all of the rest of us that stick around and talk some more. And I'll also turn off the AI companion as well. So bye, YouTube folks.